Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is having a lovely day, wherever you're at in the world or whatever time it is. Um, Today, we're going to be talking about mobility, just a bit of an introduction into mobility, why it's important, why we do it, all that good stuff, and what's different about it. Um, I think to start here, we will talk about the difference between mobility and flexibility, because those two are often intertwined, and so many people will be like, well, isn't mobility just your flexibility? And I think that makes total sense, to think that. I used to think that. I was like, well, my flexibility is my mobility, but there's some key differences, and the main key difference is mobility is your active range of motion, and flexibility is your passive range of motion. Now, what do we mean by that is your active range of motion is what you can do without any external force applied. So if you're isolating the movement of your shoulder joint here, for example, if I were to lift it up here and bring it all the way back, as far back as I can go without, moving any other part of my body, compensating, anything like that, that's my active range of motion. Now, passive range of motion is, say I were to, have a wall here or something. Just imagine this is a wall. And then you go back, and then you're able to push against that wall, and suddenly you're able to get a lot further back because you have an external force helping to push that joint into that position and that range of that motion. So that's really the key difference here. I'm gonna put my block back under here, is that active versus passive range of motion. And that comes down to really your brain and some of your brain function. So let's see, getting into it, your brain has two functions, really, at the base of it all. Your brain has the function of survival and the function of mobility. Movement is what I meant to say. Technically mobility in terms of what we're talking about here, because the active range of motion. And so the active range of motion is what the brain believes that it is safe to do. Even though you actually can go further, the brain is just not aware that it can go further than that. The brain can, just get kind of confused, I guess, sometimes. Confused isn't the right word, but, the brain recognizes patterns, and that's how it determines whether an action or a movement is safe for it to get into. So let's take an example of an injury, I guess would be a good one. So once you have an injury, your brain reacts to putting itself into like a safety mode by sending you pain signals. Now that's totally exactly what it's supposed to be doing, and that's protecting you. However, once you heal, you can still get some of those pain signals long after an injury, and that's not necessarily to say that injury is still there, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's still just your brain in that survival mode, because that's what it's become used to doing in that motion. So I had a shoulder impingement for a long time. That took me a long time to get over, and a lot of mobility work actually to get over it. And once you hit that end range of your active mobility and find that pain point, that's where your brain is telling you, stop. This is where we need to stop. But if you start doing this active mobility work where you're coming to that end range and then getting your brain used to that movement over and over and over again, repetition is key for the brain. Over and over and over again, you're coming to this end point. And then maybe next time, after a week or so, you can come a little bit further up. And it's like, oh, okay, well, that's actually safe now. And then a little bit further up. oh, okay, that's actually safe now. So that's really what mobility work is all about, is training the brain to really become comfortable again with the movement of the joint that is the normal movement of the joint. It's just the brain sometimes forgets that it's safe to go into that. And there's many reasons for that. One is injury, as I mentioned before, and that's very valid and legit one. So if you have an injury and you're recovering from it, it's very important to go very slow with mobility work. You progressively get a little bit more of that range of motion back, and then you progressively add a little bit more load as well. So what I mean by adding load here is, this is like really just the load of your arm on there. But if you start to do that range of motion and do it in a down dog, now you have that motion with your arm with, the weight of your torso and your hips and even your legs on there as well. So there's a few key elements of mobility work here. It's like, one, you try to figure out, okay, well, what is your passive range or active range of motion to your pain points? And then you start doing repetition movements there. And then you start to progressively add load to really get the brain comfortable with that movement again. And then strengthening is when you are adding that load on. And I think one thing to note too about flexibility versus mobility is, like, if you work on mobility, your flexibility is gonna follow. Like, you're gonna become a hell of a lot more flexible if you do mobility work. Mobility work is like the core work that you need to do. One of the quotes that my yoga training teacher, Ali, told me was, muscles react, joints act. And I thought that was very, on point, because your brain tells your joint to act, and then your muscles are like the ones, oh, well, I gotta react and move in order to make that joint move. So the other reason that, we get into that we'll need mobility work is, like, sometimes we just have a job or do something repetitively. Prime example, I guess, would be say that you're at a store, you're a stalker at a store, and so you're consistently taking boxes, lifting them up, or unpacking boxes and putting them on the shelves. You're doing a lot of repetitive motion up and down, flexion with your arm here on your shoulder, but you're not doing any extension. And so that's really the key with mobility work here, is you're trying to utilize and train the brain to understand all of the motions of that joint. So if you're constantly going in flexion and just down, flexion and down, and not doing any of the extension work back, which is a very important part of that rotational capacity of the shoulder joint, your brain's going to just kind of forget, oh, well, I don't really have to do this, so how far back do I have to go? Not really that far. I'm just gonna focus on this. The brain is trained to take the easiest way out. That's just human nature in general, and that's how it works with just any movement of the body. If we have to do this and this, we're only gonna do this and this. We're not gonna go back if we don't have to. And so often we don't, which is why a Shalabhasana with your arms by your side, lifting up behind you, is very good for you, and often something that most people don't really necessarily do. That was a lot. And, I hope that helps to explain why mobility is important, why we want to do it. I explained it beforehand in this way because mobility work is not glamorous, I would say. You're not doing some fancy, amazing, beautiful looking yoga pose here. Oftentimes you're just literally lifting your arm up, rotating your hand out, bringing your arm back around you, and then back down by your side, and going the other way and doing the same thing. So not glamorous looking stuff, but it's very foundational, I guess is the word for it. And if you really want to get into that beautiful, bird of paradise pose or whatever it is you're working towards, dancer's pose, it's like, exquisite kind of thing. Mobility work is really going to help. It's something that I've incorporated into a lot of my own classes and also just my own practice. I do a lot of this work on my own. It's helped me a ton. And I also notice when I don't work on it, suddenly it's just like, oh yeah, we're back to this point. But I've also noticed that doing the mobility work kind of allows that work to stick around longer than just doing yoga poses does. Because the thing about yoga poses is most of them are passive. Most all of them are passive mobility. Usually you have some external force, whether it's the floor, another muscle, another part of your body, helping to move your joint into that other position. So isolating a specific joint is one of the key parts of mobility work. Yoga incorporates so many different parts of your body, so many different joints, and that's what's beautiful about it. But that's why it's also passive, because like you're using other parts of your body to help push you into that sort of position, which is fantastic. But this foundational work with mobility is really what's going to get you to that better point, I think. So what's key, so I'm going to go over a couple key things with mobility work that we'll be talking about a lot throughout our classes. And then we'll just kind of start getting into it. Hope you'll enjoy. Hope you'll join my classes and enjoy them. That was a little smudge of joy. And anyways, so a couple of the terminology things that we're going to talk about a lot today, or in the next, however many times you're in class with me. So the first thing is what I'll call CARs, and these are controlled articular rotations. So a controlled articular rotation is when you isolate just one movement of the body, and I'm talking about the shoulders here a lot today just because it's easy. You can look at the camera and you can see my shoulders. So controlled articular rotation is just like your whole body is still, and you're really just isolating the movement of this shoulder right here. And you're trying to control just as far as you can go up without compensating with the rest of your body. So like popping out your stomach, that would be a compensation, something like that. And then you do the full movement that you can, bringing the hand all the way back down and around without moving the rest of your body. So you get to your end range point. This is like figuring out what is that end range motion that we're talking about in terms of our active mobility. So those are CARs. Then there is PALS and rails. PALS and rails are hard, I would say. They stand for, PALS stands for progressive, is it angular? Yeah, progressive angular isometric loading. And then rails is the opposite, or not the opposite, it's the opposite movement, but rails is regressive angular isometric loading. So what this means is, so progressive tissue is the long tissue of a joint, and then the regressive tissue is the short tissue of the joint. So, or whatever movement, I guess, that you're trying to work. So it's important to work both because, as I'm saying, this is working your progressive tissue right here on this joint, but you haven't worked your regressive tissue very much. So PALS and rails are really helping to balance that work on your joint muscles. So we're doing a lot of those, and I'll explain them once I get into class again, of course. So a lot of times, like, it'll just be pretty simple stuff where you're pushing into the ground and then lifting up as high as you can, and then pushing into the ground and then lifting up as high as you can, and still, again, isolating that shoulder. And so the last thing that we're going to talk about is like what's that term to isolate? So you'll hear me say irradiate your body before you start these PALS and rails. And that just means literally tense up your entire body like tense your stomach, tense your legs, tense everything, your neck, everything like that, so that really all you're doing is trying to focus just on that movement and not letting any other part of the body move. So the last thing I'm going to leave you with here, gave you a lot of information about mobility, some of the terminology that we'll be discussing throughout these classes. And finally, I'm just going to leave you with like one of the quotes from my training that really stuck with me, which is, where the attention goes, neural energy flows, and neural connection grows. And what that means, and what really stuck with me about this, and just about the whole training in general, is, if you focus your attention on a certain area, there's going to be so much more brain activity that goes to that area. And you can actually regrow neural connections, or even grow new neural connections. Mobility is like one of the few things that you can do to actually like regrow or grow new neural connections within your body, which are usually constantly dying. So it's absolutely fascinating. So just think about that. And hopefully this intro video got you a little bit excited about this. As I said, it's not the most glamorous sort of work, but it makes you feel really great afterwards. And it also is hard. Like, they are very accessible movements and poses, I guess, but also difficult. You'll be sweating sometimes just by pushing into the ground and lifting up. So I hope that helps you to understand a little bit more about mobility, and I'm really excited to have you join in my classes. Namaste.